everyone on one screen. So I thought instead of doing individual introductions, maybe we could just introduce who's represented today. So I am Angie Steffen, and I'm representing Far Reach. Well,
Angie, I don't know if you can hear us. This is Amanda Hofer. We have a group here, our CUNA Mutual group.
Mutual group. I just happened to be at the AEA building today.
is there anyone else other than Far Reach and CUNA? Hopefully everyone can talk when they want to. Technology is awesome. All right, well, welcome everyone. Super excited today because Dave, who I've also gotten the privilege of working with today, is going to be speaking on splitting patterns. And Dave Stagey is an Agile coach at CUNA. So we'll get started early, Dave. Give you more time.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Angie. Yeah, so as Angie said, I'm a Agile coach at CUNA Mutual Group. And I'll be talking about splitting patterns here today. And so if you came to this session hoping, split actual wood here like it's showing on the screen, you're probably gonna be disappointed. So this is actually working with PBIs and working on maybe finding some different ways to split your work down. For me, when I first started working with Scrum, I was really familiar with Kanban at the time, but Scrum, really challenged me in terms of, how do you break down work into time boxes, into sprints. And it was something that I really struggled with right away. And at that time probably drove my Agile coach crazy because I really struggle with this. So I'm hoping what I have here today will maybe spark some ideas for you and help you think of different ways to break down work that maybe you're struggling to break down. There's lots of folks out there who maybe have some books, articles on this. I can think of like Mike Cohen or Jeff Patton. Craig Larman is actually an individual that I got some of the inspiration for this presentation from. Okay, it's gone. Craig Larman isn't exactly known as somebody who, I guess, specializes in this, but if you dig into some of his books, he's interesting ideas on how to split work down. So some of this is inspired by that. I've done this type of presentation a few times in the past, and it's evolved over time. So again, so hopefully you find something that maybe will spark some different ideas for you. Get to my next slide. So hopefully the word got out that you should bring a PBI to this session from your backlog that maybe you're struggling to split. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end where you can maybe think through some ideas on how to actually split that, and then even present back to the group on what you did. So if you don't have a PBI in front of you or a backlog item, maybe think about one as we're going here today. I also do want to mention that there's going to be a part 2 session to this class. So on March 13th from 4:30 to 6 p.m., there's going to be a workshop at Mill Race where we'll be going through and spending most of the time kind of whiteboarding and trying to split PBIs down that people are struggling to split. So there'll be something communicated out around that through the Agile meetup. So look for that, but that again will be March 13th from 4:30 to 6 p.m. As a follow-up session to this. Agenda, so we'll go through this for about 40 minutes today, and then I think Angie had some towards the end that will leave some time for that. So to start down the path here, so why split PBIs? I mean, why do we even care about trying to do this? Why don't we just create a PBI that takes 6+ months, a year, and when we're done with the work, close it out, move on to the next PBI, right? I mean, that'd be a lot easier thing to do. So one of the biggest reasons we're trying to split PBIs is it helps to enable frequent delivery of value and helps us to think through that. If we're not doing that, then we're really missing the point of iterative development or Agile. So splitting PBIs is a great way to kind of start shifting your mindset into how do we break work down into smaller chunks of value. So where and when can you split PBIs? So a lot of times I think we traditionally think that you split PBIs, within your product backlog. If you're a Scrum team, if you're a Kanban team, similar thing within your product backlog, and that's kind of where that activity generally happens. But if you kind of shift left down the process here and get more into product management, or maybe it's portfolio management, whatever you want to call this here, there's opportunities to split and break down work here as well. So for example, if this kind of flow here is, maybe a new product ideation, all the way through, maybe market viability or ready for engineering, whatever this last column would be before it goes into your product backlog, there's opportunities to break work down here as well, so that by the time it gets to a Scrum team or a Kanban team, it's already sliced a little bit smaller. So splitting activities don't have to be just within the product backlog or within a Scrum or Kanban team. They can happen, throughout the value stream or product line as well. And so generally when you're splitting PBIs, if you're a Scrum team, backlog refinement, or product backlog refinement is a great place to do that. If you're a Scrum practitioner, that the Scrum guide kind of recommends 10% of your time you should spend refining your backlog. So you don't have to do it in a formal backlog refinement event. It's something you could actually do every day, throughout the day if you wanted. Kanban, for those of you who practice Kanban, there really are no rules to it, so you can do that within a replenishment meeting if that's something you have scheduled, to kind of line up the next batches of work that you'd like to pull in. But it's something that, your team, if you're a Kanban team, you just have to figure out the best time to split down work. But replenishment meetings would be, a good time to do that. All right, so when you're splitting PBIs, I've kind of broken this down into two sections. You can think of it in terms of boundaries and then actually splitting patterns within your boundaries. And I'll talk through the boundaries here for the next couple slides. So boundaries, you can think in terms of when you're splitting your work down, if you're splitting it past your customer or stakeholder value, that may be an indicator, red flag that you've gone too far. So you may want to have a boundary across all your PBIs that you're splitting that, hey, we don't want to split them down further than what would provide value to our customers or stakeholders. So that could be a boundary that you have that applies to all your PBIs or your product backlog items. Another boundary you could have are, that PBIs are small enough to fit within a sprint time box or lead time. So if you're splitting PBIs down and they're outside of your sprint time box or outside your lead time, then that might be an indicator that, hey, we need to keep going and continue to split. Boundaries, like this are also ways that, if your team is, truly owns the work, if you're splitting a PBI down and you cannot get it into, let's say, your sprint time box, your lead time, that may be a good indicator that you need to circle back at a later point in time, maybe inspect and adapt that type of work and figure out, the things you need to do so that you can get it within your sprint time box, as an example. So boundaries are a good thing that you can kind of come up with. They're a little more generic, but they would apply across all of your PBIs as you're splitting them down. To further boundaries, team design can also influence how you split your PBIs. So a lot of us have probably gone through in the past, maybe like the hamburger exercise or maybe the layered cake exercise where you're kind of splitting your PBI across all the different, through the technology stack, for example. And, a lot of teams aren't necessarily or may not be structured in a way that you have control of the entire technology stack. Maybe you have a portion of it. So a lot of times those exercises don't really apply to those teams, and you can kind of walk out of those maybe even a little deflated because it doesn't apply to how you work. So depending on how your team is structured, it could also influence maybe some of the boundaries you put in. So for example, let's say your team is split across DBA, and this is like a generic tech stack here. So, it kind of is what it is. Hopefully it can kind of apply to everybody. Middle tier, you could have a bunch of stuff in there. It could be, policy administration system or an ERP system, or maybe it's API development, interfaces, whatnot. But that's everything in between your UX, UI, and your database. So let's say that your team is a database team, for example. And within the industry, you may hear these teams referred to as maybe like a specialist team, component team, capability team. So if you recognize yourself as this type of team, then obviously you're going to know you can't split across the entire technology stack, because that's not how your team's structured. But you can think about things in terms of, can we split across the various roles that we have on our team? So instead of creating maybe a PBI for analysis, and a PBI for database development, and a PBI for database testing or whatnot, you kind of roll it up a little bit and say, how do we create an item for the entire team? And then maybe those team roles or team jobs become tasks within that PBI. So you could add a boundary to that previous slide that says all PBIs must be written for the entire team. So that'd be another boundary that you could add to your team. So let's say though that your team does happen to slice across all the different technology stacks for whatever you're trying to develop. So in this case, you'd still want to, well, first of all, these types of teams here that slice across all your technology stacks are referred to, you may hear it as a development team. So in Scrum, that would be called a development team, or a cross-functional team, or some literatures or white papers or books out there refer to this as a feature team as well. So if you're one of these teams, you may be able to expand your boundaries a little bit. So you may be able to say, okay, let's create, one of our boundaries is we want to make sure we still write PBIs that encompass all roles on the team. But then we also could add in there, we want to create PBIs that split across the entire technology stack. So we're not writing a PBI just for the database. We're not writing a PBI for just the UX or UI layer, et cetera, et cetera. We're writing PBIs that cover all the layers. So you can expand your boundaries a little bit if you're a team that fits within a vertically sliced team here. So these are some additional boundaries, again, that you could add to that previous slide that you would want to apply to all of your PBIs. All right, so the next slide here gets into, the next couple slides get into, the splitting patterns that you might be able to use, and then also a kind of a process flow that you could use in thinking through how to break PBIs down. So I've kind of got this little diagram here, but again, kind of on the outside, you've got your splitting boundaries that we just talked through. So those are things you want to apply to all your PBIs, or strive to apply to all your PBIs. And then within these are some of the splitting patterns that we'll go through here on this slide. So I'll just start from the top. This is in no particular order here, but it's just some different things to think through if you're struggling with breaking a PBI down into smaller slices of value. So user paths, workflow, use cases. My screen there, oops, sorry about that. I'm giving my previous next slide away. User paths, workflow, use cases. So what are the paths a user may take? Are they all necessary right now? And can steps be simplified? So let's say you have a PBI that is, I want to self-service my insurance policy. So that maybe is the description of your PBI. Well, you could take a look at that and start breaking it down into how a user would actually go about self-servicing their PBI and try to follow the paths that they might take, and maybe take slices out of that. So for example, what are all the things that I might want to self-service on my insurance policy? And once you kind of lay that all out, maybe address changes is a path that most users would go down, and that's something that they would want to try to change most frequently. So maybe that's where the most of the value is, if you slice that down into just focusing on address changes. So that'd be one split, or one way to think of user paths, workflows, and use cases. So how are people actually using your software? And is every single path actually needed right away to provide value? And then business rules would be the next one here. So what rules apply to the PBI? Are they all necessary right now? Can rules be simplified? So business rules could be, maybe you have internal business processing rules that business users want to make sure the software abides to, or maybe there's compliance rules, or maybe there's regulations that you need to make sure occur within that PBI. So are all of those business rules needed right away, day one, to provide value? So based on that, you could split based on the different business rules. Operations is another thing you can think through. So what are all the operations that are needed for this functionality? So thinking in terms of create, read, update, and delete, are they all necessary right now? So if we think of our self-servicing insurance policy example on an address change, if we were to implement that, do we need create, read, update, delete functionality right away? Or maybe we just focus on read, because today you can't even read your insurance or your address on your insurance policy. So if we just had it displayed, that provide a lot of value right away. And then maybe the next step we look at, well, maybe we do update capabilities and focus on that, which would then provide more value to maintaining your insurance policy, as an example. So just thinking through all the different operations and thinking through, are they all needed right away to provide value? So there's a bit of a theme here, and it always should come back to providing value, and ultimately, when you're splitting it down, do they fit within your boundaries? So if you're using these patterns, you're splitting it down, and then you start going outside of the boundaries that we mentioned before, that's a bit of a red flag that maybe you've gone too far, or maybe you need to find a different pattern in here that we're going through. Roles, personas. So what roles are involved in the PBI? Are all the roles necessary right now? So going back to the address change example, who are we focusing on? Are we focusing on the customer making those changes? Are we focusing on maybe internal back office administrators making address changes for customers who call in? So who are we focusing this functionality on? And you can split based on that. So let's say our focus really should be the customer. You could split on customer and start thinking down that path, and then maybe have another split around back office administrators. So that's another way to think about breaking it down, is who are all of the users who are going to be using that functionality, and do they all need to use it right away on day one to get the most value? Acceptance criteria. So a lot of times PBIs have a lot of acceptance criteria in them. Are they all necessary? Are some more complex and maybe could be deferred a little bit till later on, or maybe the complex stuff is the stuff we got to do right away. And is everything relevant? So, splitting based on the acceptance criteria of your PBI. Maybe there's additional items in there that could be taken out that aren't needed right away to provide value. You could create a separate PBI that encompasses that acceptance criteria. Platforms is another one to think through. So again, the address change. Do we want the address change for insurance policies to be available on a browser right away, on a mobile app, et cetera, et cetera? So think about all the different ways a user could make that address change, kind of going back to that example. And are all those platforms needed day one, or could we split across the platforms and deliver certain ones first and then deliver the other ones later on? So thinking through all the different platforms that people may use for the PBI that you're writing. And then kind of getting into error handling. So what are the error handlers? Do we need to handle every single situation right away? Are there certain things that we could defer to later on? Maybe those situations might not occur day one, or maybe if we do think they're going to occur, but they could take a lot of time. But is there a way we could create just a generic error message? For example, let's say an error occurs and you just display a number saying, hey, could not process your address change right now. Please call the call center at 1-800 whatever. So you could do things like that as well to kind of streamline the amount of work that maybe goes into error handling, and split on error handling. So same theme here with that. I mean, we're trying to figure out ways that we can provide value as frequently as possible right away. So again, error handling is something you could potentially defer. Parameters. So what are the application's parameters, and are they all relevant right now? So you can have lots of input, output parameters on an application. Do you need to code for every single one of those? Maybe you can create some stub applications that will get you through so that you can provide value right away. So thinking through those parameters, and are there ways you could split on that? So these are all different patterns that maybe your team could use or think through. Maybe some teams could benefit from some of these from like operations, but other teams may benefit more from acceptance criteria. But overall, it's thinking through the different patterns that may help your team to break work down, and then how do you, and then what are the boundaries that you always want to try to keep your team in when you're splitting down PBIs. So to continue on this, so kind of a splitting pattern flow example that I put together is, let's say you've got your initial PBI. How do you start breaking that down and keeping track of all the different splits or slices that you've done? So one way to kind of think through this is, if you had your first PBI, we'll go back to the example that we had, which is, want to self-service my insurance policy. Well, let's say the first split we do is we say, okay, well, let's create a PBI for self-servicing your insurance policy with just the address change only. And then all the other functionalities or capabilities could be down here. After you do that split, then it's always a good thing to ask yourself is, does that split fit within the boundaries that you put together? So does that split still provide value to your customers and stakeholders? Does that split fit within your PBI or fit within your sprint, or does it fit within your lead time if you're a Kanban team? If it doesn't, then that's a good indicator that you need to keep going. So then you could split it down even further. So we talked about, well, maybe you can split on platforms. So maybe slice A up here is browser for address change, and B is mobile app. So same thing, you'd ask those same questions. Does it fit to our boundaries? If it doesn't, then you keep going. You can kind of keep this trail of how you got to where you got to as you keep splitting. And so let's just say for this example that we created these different paths, and all of these PBIs fit within our boundaries, and we feel good that we could pull them into a sprint and deliver value within a sprint. Or if you're a Kanban team, pull it into your Kanban board and deliver it within your lead time. So if you get down to this point and say, okay, here's all the new PBIs that will provide value, then the question becomes, well, what do you do with the original ones that you had over here? And the first thing you could do is just delete them, right? Because you don't need them anymore. Or if you use features or epics, maybe these turn into like features or epics, and these PBIs link back into those. But point being, this is the actual work that you'd be pulling into a sprint or within your Kanban board. You're not going to be pulling in the original PBI of, I want to self-service my policy. And so, there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can do this activity on a whiteboard and start keeping track of this pattern. So if you did that on a whiteboard, you might see an example. So I kind of got down here what this would look like. You would start off, this is kind of hard to read, but you'd start off with what your original PBI was, and then you'd start splitting it off with these different, with colons, for example, and then say, okay, we're gonna split by address change. And so in this scenario, I've got 3 different splits on address change, 3 different PBIs by address change. Maybe then you split by customer, or maybe you split by back office administrator. So we did a split there by a role or user. And then we split by technology platform. Then we split by operations. So you can kind of keep that entire trail of how you got to where you got to. And then that's the, you could use this as a description of your PBI going, if you're using like a, if you're using Jira or Microsoft TFS or something like that, you could put that back in a Jira as your description and then further explain that out, within that PBI. But this is kind of the path that you would see, or I've seen people use this in a spreadsheet. So if you had a spreadsheet, that would be kind of your product backlog within your spreadsheet. So again, main thing here is, as you're splitting, always making sure that what you're working on fits within your boundaries, and asking yourself each time through this that it fits, that each split does fit within your team's boundaries, which could be different team by team. All right, so I believe that was all the content I had. So first of all, I guess, are there any questions on this? Or the other option is, if you have a PBI that you brought with you, we could spend some time also just trying to split those. And Angie, I don't know what time it is here. 12.
It's only 12:25. You're good.
Okay, so we have a good amount of time here where if people did bring PBIs that they're struggling with, that you could kind of walk through this, and I can try to. Can you still see my screen or not?
No.
Okay. So I'm going to try to show those 2 slides. Do you see it now?
Yeah, I see your PowerPoint.
Okay. So I'm going to try to share all right. I'm try to show these 2 slides at the same time. I'm going to screw up my presentation, but that's okay. Oop. Maybe. I'm going to try to show these at the same time here. Might not work. So I guess I'll open it up to the group here. Are there any questions that you have on this, on these examples here, before maybe we take some time to actually split some PBIs that people are struggling with? So, and I'll try to get this so you can see both slides at the same time here. So are there any questions on the phone? No questions? Bear with me as I'm playing with my screen. There we go. Okay, did anybody bring a PBI they'd like to try to split that they're struggling with? Angie, did you bring one?
I was going to ask Sam if we could maybe talk about the leases.
Because if you wanted to, you could take that leases example, try to think about maybe the boundaries you want to stay within as you're splitting it down, and then think through some of these patterns here on how you want to start splitting it down a little bit further, and then use this flow here to break down that leases example. So the end result could be something like what I showed at the bottom here. You'd have kind of like your string of splits. So we could try to do that if you'd like. Does anybody else have anything? Everybody split masters?
I'm hoping people can unmute themselves.
If you don't have any PBIs, I guess I'm interested also if this helps you to think through some things differently, or if this was kind of something you maybe already thought through in the past. So I'm not sure if this is new for folks or if it's new. Silence.
We're supposed to be people that ask questions nonstop, right?
Because if there are no questions, and if people didn't bring PBIs, or maybe you just don't want to bring it up or whatnot, again, we do at the workshop that we're going to have on March 13th, where it'll be more hands-on and actually, do some of this stuff on whiteboards and help think through how to break your work down. Did you have the far reach example?
Yeah, so
thanks, Sam.
You're welcome. I was trying to give everyone else an opportunity since I was kind of thrown out first. So basically what we were working on was creating a lease in a system. So just like any lease that you have when you're renting either a commercial building or an apartment or anything like that. So the concept around it was relatively simple. And basically we kind of already split it down to using the CRUD, the operation. So we had already split it down into just creating, and we split out editing and deleting kind of in one swoop. So we could split out the edit and delete into 2 separate stories. Kind of thinking through that example there. We only have certain roles that can create in our system. So we have it split down by only the roles that can create a lease, just permissions wise. Brian, did we split this out any other way? I think Brian's on.
I'm here. Well, we split, there was an index page to list them, so the read part, and we split that out. We had the edit, delete, split out, and we had the overall create kind of split out, rather than having just one monolithic story.
So we had already, sorry, we had already split it out quite a few ways. I was just curious if there were other ways that we could have split it, maybe past that.
Well, I can share an interesting finding if that's okay. We had a meeting with the client yesterday, and what we realized is our story for just the whole create and everything, with everything that was there, we didn't have any kind of wireframed prototype beforehand. And so we spent a lot of time building out the story, and we didn't necessarily hit all the targets, even though we hit the AC on the stories, because we didn't have everything kind of envisioned as to how it's going to go. But so basically, I think one thing we could have done better on that is split the create story into a design phase. And even if that's just an HTML stub of what we think it should look like, rather than building the entire, start to finish read and write to the database operations along with that in the story, we could have split the story out a little bit that way. I think it would have saved us time, probably would have gotten us to a better product in the end.
Awesome. And so as you guys are splitting, at Far Reach, do you guys have like the larger boundaries that you're trying to stick within? Just out of curiosity.
I think
to keep them within a sprint, keep them written for all users.
delivering to the client is a big one, like making sure it's a deliverable.
Yeah, one boundary we've kind of set, Angie, is that we've determined that the smaller we can keep our stories and the more focused we can keep our stories, the better we are at delivering within budget constraints and timelines. And so we try to keep stories from ranging more than, we'd like stories to be something that you can action on within a day, in the most part. Does that make sense?
Very nice. Sounds good. Any other comments you want to make on Far Reach? And I think CUNA's had some technical issues with their audio.
Yeah, are we transmitting now?
Oh, I can hear you now.
All right.
Did Far Reach have anything else to add to some things they've tried with splitting, or discover anything new with this that may help?
The only other thing I'll add is that when Dave said that he was going to be talking about splitting patterns, I was like, because as Brian pointed out, like we try to keep our work small. I thought, oh, we don't, we keep them pretty small. It'll be like, I don't know if we really struggle with this, but then when I really looked at it, we really, there are those stories that tend to be a little bigger than they should. So I appreciate you doing this. It was very timely.
Yeah.
So I'll follow up on one, Dave. We talked about, or we had trouble on our team getting within the boundary of the sprint, getting the work done and having it be testable all within the sprint, or having it be at a point where we can take it to the customer. And how to, so if we make it too small, you can't do one or both of those, or you can't do both of them for sure. There's just nothing to show for it.
Yep. Yeah, and that's where having those boundaries is important, right? So if one of your boundaries is we want to make sure it provides value to your customer, stakeholder, end user, whatever you're trying to provide value to, and you're slicing beyond that, that's something that your team should really be again, if your team really owns the work, you should really be striving to, find ways to get that within your sprint. But if you're slicing it down beyond value, that's really something you want to try to stay away from, even if it goes beyond your sprint, right? So let's say you slice it down to the point of value to your customer or stakeholder. Maybe you just keep it there, even though it goes beyond a sprint. You make sure that you're open to your product owner, whoever, that, hey, this is gonna go beyond our normal time box, but it provides the value that you're looking for. And then outside of that, maybe you have some inspect and adapt session, for example, and you go through and you look at that type of work and say, well, why is it taking us longer than our sprint time box to get this done? What are some things that are causing that to happen? And then finding ways or some action items to start maybe reducing that down, if it's wait time or if it's dependencies, whatever the case may be, but at least making that visible that, hey, this type of work, every time it comes to us, it's going to go beyond our sprint time box, because we want to make sure we're delivering value. We don't want to slice beyond value. But at this current point, based on delays or dependencies or whatever the case may be, it's just going to go beyond our sprint time box, and making that visible. So if you're slicing beyond value, hopefully the team is really challenging themselves to say, we really shouldn't be doing that.
I think what, and you talked about, Dave, but what I found that we've been using with one of our teams, and you mentioned, was that like the hamburger activity, but taking a PBI that feels too big, and if it doesn't really seem like it can split on any of these ways that you described here, but really taking it out, looking at the technical steps, and then thinking about how can you make some of those technical steps, like what are the kind of like easiest, quickest way to the most like robust, and are there steps in between, and can you kind of slice through those steps and take like a kind of low fidelity approach, but get somewhere, and then like iterate on top of that if you're at least like getting value at the end. I think that's been helpful for our team, just to think, because we tend to really think in those technical steps for getting something done, and even when they seem really big, are there ways you can maybe pare those down so you can get something to that customer and then iterate on it, or if you are like a middle person, get it to the next step, and then kind of iterate and build upon that process to make it better.
Yeah, awesome.
Something else to think about too is leveraging data mocking and test-driven development. Sometimes you can get something that's showable without having to necessarily do the whole PBI, if that makes sense. Like if you're owning the UX and the middleware traditionally around Mutual, the expectation has been the data people do the data stuff, and then once they're done, the middleware people do the middle stuff, and then you pass it on. If you have a general idea of what the data looks like or what your user need is, you can be utilizing data mocks to be starting, and the middleware people and the UX people can be doing stuff based on what they're pretty sure the data is going to look like when it's there. And especially if you're owning that front end, that's what business stakeholders really like to see, right? That's our opportunity to show off. So at some point, just understanding that I'm just going to pretend that the CIS team gives me whatever it is I was asking for, and then write something with some dummy nonsense data. That's still something you can show. That in my experience has value in the stakeholder's eyes. They don't know that none of the actual wiring is there. But that's another way to maybe, but then the UX work's done. So that's something to slice. That's a really efficient way to slice that I think overall CUNA Mutual, we don't do it that way a lot. And we maybe should start. And same thing between the data people and the middleware people too, right? If we generally know what the data people are going to give us, we can do the exact same thing at that layer too. So, and then granted, once you start wiring it up, stuff changes a little bit. That's a different PBI, and now you slice it. So that might be something to think about, is do you have opportunities to kind of develop in that pattern? I don't know, maybe you do, maybe you don't, but I throw my 2 cents out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all great, right? I mean, the biggest challenge with this is really just trying something and then seeing if it works. If it doesn't work, then trying something different. So all the ideas you just threw out there, maybe some of those work, maybe some of them don't, but you know, you really need to try to figure that out and kind of build up some data to say, hey, we've been trying to split on this path. That seems to work. Let's keep trying it. Or that didn't work. Let's try something different. So yeah, trying different things to find a better way to work is what we're really trying to do here.
Plus, then with what you're talking about, Nick, then you can get early feedback loops from the customer of that UX isn't going to work for me at all, and there's a ton of value there knowing that now for sure. Instead of after several sprints of large development are done.
Yeah. Historically, that's the last piece we do at Q-Mutual, and that's the piece that requires the most iterations to get it to the point our business users like.
Yeah.
Typically. Yeah. Good point.
We basically did what you were talking about for BDS when we were building that. We did the database middle layer and UX all at the same time.
Yeah.
And how the first thing that the middle layer did was give fake data to the UX.
Mm-hmm.
So the front end would make a call to the middle layer and say, here's my policy number, and the middle layer would just have some basic dumb hard-coded knowledge or logic of this policy ends in a 2, so I'm going to give this response. This one ends in a 4, I'm going to give that response. And it just allowed us to work through the scenarios of data that we would get from the database, even though there was no database. There wasn't real logic in the middle layer yet. It just allowed all those pieces to move a lot faster.
And so that did help you, and that helped you keep the scope of your PBI small, you think?
Yeah,
good.
I think that helped a lot, didn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't quite data mocking like you were talking about, because we weren't that good yet, but.
It's the same principle, right?
Yeah.
And you learn about it and you do it. Cool.
Awesome. Any other questions or examples anybody wants to run through? Are there any other PBIs somebody wants to try to run through this, you know, kind of boundary pattern scenario? And by the way, we need to expand this beyond CUNA and far reach. That would be awesome. All right, well, if there's nothing else, Angie, I think you had some topics. So I'll turn it back over to you. Before I do that, just again, reminder, we are gonna, if you can think of some items that you're struggling on splitting, or you have different ideas of patterns that may fit into this list here, or things that you've done, you've seen work, we are gonna have that workshop on March 13th, starting at 4:30 to 6 at Millrace.
Yeah, so just to talk about that a little bit more. So as the Agile meetup team, we had said we would want to do a couple times throughout the year where we'd meet in person or have the opportunity for people to meet in person since we are remote. So that workshop is an excellent opportunity to do that. And now that you're thinking about bigger, you know, PBIs and you have until March 13th, surely we can all find a few things we could work on and bring those with us to the workshop to learn a little bit more on how we can split them. So I know I became more aware of it once we talked a little bit about it. So, so I just wanted to wrap up. It looks like we might finish a little early today, but we should probably try to expand this past QNet and Far Reach. I would agree. You guys are awesome, and I love the partnership, but it is about getting more people involved. So please invite anyone you can. And then next month, we have Elise speaking on, I forgot what you called it already. What was that?
Go ahead, Angie.
Yeah, we're just magically muting and unmuting.
Oh, is Elise there?
No,
Oh,
not anymore.
okay. Anyway, Elise will be speaking. I cannot, sorry, remember what it was, But I will send out a Facebook event again, so we will have that to share ahead of time. I was curious if there's any items that anyone wants to talk about. Like we have a Trello backlog board item with things that we want people to speak on, and then we can try to find people to talk to those things. So are there any things that anyone's struggling with that you'd like us to look into finding someone to speak on?
Since he's displaying, can Dave maybe show us this board so we can see? I've never seen it before.
The rating structure.
I don't know.
Yeah, I was gonna guess that. Elise was speaking on liberating structures.
Thank you. I was digging for it. Thank you.
I was guessing that was what it was, but I just wanted to get it out there.
And do you guys do sprint reviews?
Interesting question. So we just did, we do client demos. We've always done client demos, but we know there's a difference between a client demo and a sprint review. So we just held our first one this week, and that's actually the meeting that Brian was talking about, where we were getting feedback from the client about like the lease form. So we just started a first official one this week. And since Far Each does custom software, so like all of our clients are different, we found that some of these sprint reviews will be tailored different for different clients, but we do plan on doing them.
How did it go as compared to a customer demo? Did you get more feedback, earlier feedback, better feedback?
I'd say we got probably more feedback. Really what we got out of it was we actually had the client drive themselves instead of us walking it through. It made them pay a little bit closer attention to the detail of what we had developed for them, which got them asking some different questions around what they asked for and what they're seeing, and which is why Brian brought up in our lease example about getting a design ahead of time would have been helpful, because I think it would have helped meet expectations in a little bit better way. But it definitely was more frequent feedback than what we would have gotten before, for sure.
Is that maybe a, sorry.
Yeah, I was bringing it up because it might be a good topic, especially if you guys are just starting it and we've tried before, but it doesn't work out so well. So I think that could be a good topic.
Yeah, that sounds great. Does anyone have any other ideas for future topics? Okay. Does anyone have any events or things that are coming up, or things that would be good for the team to know, or the Agile Meetup team, to know about that are coming up in the area or even online?
You talked about the lean coffees.
Oh, sure. So Lean Coffee is held once a month. I think it's the third Wednesday of the month. And usually Far Reach is hosted, but we've had people step up like Dave to offer to host in different places. But it's a group that gets together and is focused on lean. So there's people from all over. So software is obviously represented, and then manufacturing, and then we have some, other companies that come and participate. We've had even a government agency, the Blackhawk County something, came. So it's an interesting mix of people, and we talk about all things lean, and it's a lean coffee format. So if you don't know what that is, you come and you throw up stickies of different ideas, and then you vote on the ones that make the most sense, and you talk them through, and you time box them, and then move on. So it's a very informal, but I always find it very beneficial meeting. So I couldn't share that information.
Yeah, I attended the one last month, and it was a really good, diverse group of individuals who showed up to it across many different industries just within the Cedar Valley. So there's a lot of good discussions in that group.
And you do not have to be a member of the ILC. It's open to whoever. Are there any other things coming up? Try to count to 6 every time. So if there's nothing else, I guess that's all we have for today. Thank you guys for coming. Be sure to share. And if you have ideas on things to do or improve, be sure to let me know.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.